It's Nonprofit Conversations, the podcast of Road Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Supp. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't miss an episode. We're on all major podcast services. This week, I talk with my longtime friend, Pamela Kaul of Association Strategies, a professional executive recruiter. Welcome to episode 178, where our topic is the nonprofit CEO job. Is it for you? Hey everybody, it's Monday, January 9th, and that means it's time for our first episode of 2023. I'm your host, Cecilia Supp. I'm a certified association executive, and I'm the principal and founder of Road Tulips Consulting. To our global audience, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be, and thanks for joining us. We're really excited to kick off season 5 with my longtime friend and colleague, Pamela Kaul, who really should have been on this podcast a long time ago. So Pamela, thanks for joining us today. Pamela is going to be talking with us about the nonprofit CEO job. Is it for you? But before we jump into the topic, Pamela, welcome. And please take a moment to say hello to our audience and tell us a little about yourself.
Thank you, Cecilia. It's great to be with you and to kick off 2023. I'm still wondering where 2022 went, but it's good to be with all of you, and I appreciate this opportunity. I'm Pamela Kaul, of course, and I am the president of Association Strategies. And we are a retained executive search and transition management firm headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area. But like a lot of organizations these days, we're scattered pretty much throughout the country. And our client base is strictly associations and nonprofits. While we recruit people from all industries and professions, our client base has remained the space that all of us are most interested in. And I am delighted to be with all of you.
Great. Thank you, Pamela. And one of the things I think we all know has changed, you referenced that you have a remote virtual organization like many of us have now. And a lot of that was influenced by the lockdown in reaction to the global pandemic of 2020 to, let's say, 2021, because like you, I don't know where the heck 2022 went either. But our environment has changed, and the way people look at things has changed, and the way we do things has changed. So when you're looking at a new year, maybe you're looking at a new career path, maybe you're looking at moving into that C-suite job, what are some of the things about the environment that has changed and people should take into consideration?
You know, it's a great question, and especially as we start this new year, because as we all know, the pace of change for the past 2 years is striking. I don't know how to better describe it. We are still feeling the effects of COVID on new ways of work, when and where and how we work. The calls for racial and social justice, which are heightened around the world, which of course have raised a renewed interest in diversity in all of its, the broad definition and in all of its many forms. There are continuing threats of inflation, economic anxiety. A lot of associations are still trying to replace lost income from meetings, from members, from other products and services. There's climate change. There's geopolitical polarization, as we're seeing currently in our country, but it also exists in our organizations. And even something like Supreme Court decisions, how they impact a lot of organizations. I've heard many associations say to me, our members don't want to go to states that don't honor women's freedoms. So in every aspect of the world and of the environment, I think it's changed. So the good news is there are lots of opportunities. The question is, are you ready for them? And how do you become CEO ready?
Well, that's an interesting question. CEO ready. So when you say CEO ready, what do you think of or look for in a potential candidate?
You know, I don't know. People ask me, well, what, what's new, what's different? You always want something new coming down the pike. I'm not so sure that the skill sets are different, but I think there's different definitions. And I think they've taken on a different priority. So first of all, sitting in many, many search committee meetings, interviews with boards and with search committees, one of the things that comes up over and over again is managing through uncertainty. And I think most of the pundits can agree that uncertainty is here to stay. It's not one and done. So boards want to know, for example, how have you led your current or previous organization through these uncertain times? And what have you learned as a result? And the piggyback to that is, how will you prepare us for any future uncertainty that might come our way? So examining the vulnerabilities in your organization, what can be fixed, changed, altered in any way to help prepare that organization for the future. So what the boards say to us is, we expect the CEO to be able to do that. Even though we think boards have vision, that might be in a different way. They expect their CEO to have the ability, the intellectual curiosity to look ahead, look down the road. What should we be prepared for so that we don't fall into this grip that caught all of us so much unaware? Certainly the focus on DEI. DEI has always been in these job descriptions, but not in the same way, obviously, that it is now. So first of all, boards are asking in search committee interviews, how do you define DEI? What's your definition? And what have you done, current, previous jobs, to lead DEI efforts in your organization? What were the outcomes? How do you measure success in that area? So I think it's very different. One of the, an interesting approach that a client of mine did, as a quick example, is they looked at all the jobs in their organization. I don't know how often we do this. We look at a job after somebody leaves, right? And then sometimes we take a good hard look at it and say, well, how could it be restructured? What could we shuffle off perhaps to somebody else? What could we add on to it to make it more of a significant role? Well, they analyzed all the jobs in the organization and got a series of attorneys, got the wage and hour people in there, and made all jobs exempt. So what they learned was, first of all, it removed any crumb of unintended bias in the organization. Everybody was equal. The people that were eligible for overtime, they grossed up their salaries so they wouldn't lose anything. And when they really looked at things, they saw that it was really the diversity that was the motivation, because all of the non-exempt people, most of them tended to be people of color. So this removed, again, any sort of unintended bias. It's created a better culture overall, and it's helped in their recruitment efforts, because now everybody is essentially on an equal playing field. Not that some jobs aren't bigger or have more relevance to mission, different pay ranges and so on, but the categories that, oftentimes arbitrary categories, even though there are strict wage and hour laws about that. But that's removed. So while that's not going to work for everybody, that's for sure, it clearly is something I think we're thinking about in organizations. Clearly, yeah. Another thing, embracing transformation in all of its many forms. Digital, we've talked about that, technology, embracing technology, but it's really, you and I talked a little bit before this session, Cecilia, about how to do things differently. You always growing, always changing, always flipping under that rock to see what might be under it. I mean, I could talk about this stuff all day, so it's a loaded question for me. But
I could talk about all.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for.
I don't know how long the audience has, though.
Yeah, really. That's right. You'll have to give me a timeout another couple of minutes. But I think one other thing that I think is really critical, you know how boards hate turnover. Boards not like turnover. And it doesn't even matter for what reason the turnover occurs. They just don't like it. It seems unsettling. So we've got a situation now with these hybrid workforces. How do you virtually mentor staff? So there's been a really increased interest on developing future leaders, and particularly the mid-level staff, and creating really strong professional development, leadership development programs with some real muscle around them. And interestingly, HBR published a piece of research, it might have been this week or last week, and they said that only 20% of leadership development occurs in structured classes. 20%. That 70% occurs through observation and experimentation. So the opportunities to observe leaders, to be able to talk to them about their leadership style, to shadow people. And then the last 20% comes from how do you put it in practice, sort of that self-reflection piece. And I thought that was really interesting because you can see all of these behaviors of different leaders that you admire. And we were talking once again about different people in history who have made a difference. And what were some of the things that they modeled? You know, you talked about Dorothy Parker. She was a good friend. So I think that self-reflection helps you take all these things and think about how you put it in practice to make your own style.
And that's for wow, so many topics. Those could each be a separate podcast episode. I could talk about all those. Just really quick for our global audience, Pamela referenced HBR. Here in the United States, we're referring to Harvard Business Review. So if you get that online, that was the article that Pamela referenced. And so many things you have said, like about reviewing job descriptions. I don't think we do that often enough. I unfortunately agree. Too many organizations wait till somebody leaves. And then all of a sudden we're moving the chairs on the Titanic. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be constantly reviewing, updating, assessing what are the roles, who do we need, when do we need them, and what type of skills do we need to bring into the organization or develop within the staff we already have. One of the things I do for clients is compensation studies. And so and only for staff, not for professions or industries. I do it for specific associations or nonprofits. And what I look at is not just the money. I look at, what's the job description say? Is it consistent? Is this consistent with other people who are exempt? Is this pay scale consistent with people who supervise people? So many different things go into it. And a lot of these things get overlooked over time because we're moving on to the next thing that day. Oh, we got to check the email. We got to go to a meeting. We got to plan a conference. And building your team is really crucial. I think we can all agree on that. But if you're going to have job descriptions in the first place, please stop adding that line. This is my opinion, not Pamela's. Please stop adding that line and other duties as assigned.
Oh, yeah.
You just blew up the whole job description. There's no point in having it. Try to keep it focused. If you don't want to do specifics, that's cool. Don't do specifics. Have a broad theme of a job description, but make sure that it's clear. One of the other things, before I go too far down that rabbit hole, that I like to talk to people about are career arcs. And people don't necessarily think about those. And we all have one. It's, where are you going? How did you get there? And when I was a chief staff executive, I developed a career arc for every employee.
That's great.
And well, thank you. I think it's a great idea. It seemed obvious to me. It's why I don't like write great books and become wealthy and famous, because it's just obvious. You should just do this, right? Let somebody else make the money. But so for a career arc, you look at where they are, you ask them where they want to be. Do they want to stay there long term or maybe move on somewhere else? And that's okay too. I actually had an employee say, I want your job someday. And I said, great, let's make that happen, because I'm not going to be here forever. So let's do that. So doing that, talking to your staff, mentoring. Pamela, you mentioned mentoring. I'm very passionate about that as well. And I do a lot of it on my own. I actually ran a mentoring program for a year as an ad hoc volunteer. I just did it because people needed it. So all those things are so important. And that is what allows us, I think, coming back to this topic, this part of the topic of the environment, it's what allows us to deal with that uncertainty. It allows us to develop those plans. It allows us to be able to say, oh, okay, Black Swan event.
Yeah.
Down. What are we going to do? And so the groups that are still around are the ones who are able to I know everybody's sick of the word pivot, but they were able to pivot. They could switch. I have a friend who's like, I hate the P word, but they're the ones that are still around. And what I saw, I did a qualitative study near the end of 2020 about it. And it was the smaller associations and organizations that were able to move more quickly and really adapt. Because again, using the Titanic metaphor, turning a ship around takes a long time. And the bigger the ship is, the longer it takes. So I think that's a lot of things that we all need to be constantly thinking about. The old ways of doing things are not necessarily the best way. Some things still work, but I really think in the nonprofit profession and community, we have to let go of that. That's the way we've always done it. That's the way it is. And we really need to communicate that to our boards and our other volunteer leaders. You were saying something about boards don't like turnover. They don't like transitions in staff very much because it's unsettling for them. Well, why are we having the turnover in the staff? Let's look at that. What's the root cause of that? But the other thing is everything's not going to stay the same forever. And that's why we have to be able to be adaptable. So kind of moving on with the top. Okay, that's my like really long-winded response to all the wonderful things Pamela shared.
But you did touch on something. I mean, the recruitment and retention is really, really key. And we all know that there's great competition for good staff. And they're in short supply. The baby boomers were the last of the generations to have so many people in the workforce at the same time. None of the other cohorts come near the sheer numbers that the baby boomers have had. So there's a lot of competition. And we know even in CEO search, it's been really interesting. It used to be that when we contacted a potential CEO candidate, they would say, oh, great. How big is it? What is the staff? What is the budget size? Where is it located? It was metrics driven. Now candidates say, interesting, let me do some research and I'll get back to you. So it's right away, it's not about the metrics. It's about is this an organization whose mission I can support? Is this an organization whose political activities I can support and advocate for? Is it an organization whose values and mission statement reflect my own? Mm-hmm. And that's what is drawing candidates to a specific job. Is what they say they are really how they practice? And people go to Glassdoor. Of course, they've been doing that for years, and all kinds of other sites to really see what the matchup is. And it takes candidates a long time to decide whether they want to move forward in it or not. And it's not just about size. So before it was more like an assessment of whether this is really a step up for me. Mm-hmm. Now it's about, does this organization mirror or reflect my sense of values? And I think that's important to keep in mind, because that not only is a recruitment aspect, but it's a retention aspect as well.
That is such an interesting point, because my entire career, I have never taken a job at a place where I felt I would be uncomfortable. Now, it may have turned into an uncomfortable situation later when you find out what it's really like, but yeah, as far as the like, what do they do? What is their mission? Who do they serve? And again, Camp Obvious here, to me, that would be kind of, the first thing you would think about. You may not, as a first-time chief staff executive, want to go into a $100 million, 100,000 member trade association. You might want to start a little smaller. So in that consideration, I could see that, but I really have always looked at that. What do you do? Who do you serve? I've always liked working at professional societies because you work with the individuals within a profession. I know some people love trade associations, and that's cool too. They have a great purpose as well. But I've always, I guess maybe this goes back to my chapter relations experience, where I worked one-on-one with the leaders. Yeah, and so I think that's, really connecting with the members. And I think that's really why I came to like that aspect of it. But trade associations do such wonderful work in advocacy and policy development and creation and promotion. And I love policy too. So, but you have to pick one, can't pick both. So all the time. But I think that's really important. I actually had a conversation like that very early in my career. I worked at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And that was back in the late 80s. Ronald Reagan was still president. That's how long ago it was. And so almost everybody in DC started out at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or worked there at one point early in their career. And so I was one of those people. And a coworker was going on and on and on about how they hated this position and they hated that position. And I can't agree or support with that position. And I looked at him and I said, why are you here?
Yeah, no kidding.
If you hate
No
the
kidding.
positions and the mission of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, why did you take this job?
It's so true and interesting, going back to the title of this session about the nonprofit CEO job, is it right for you? A lot of current CEOs who are what we would say quite seasoned, who've been at it for a while, I think got knocked off their stride, as we all did through this pandemic. And what some of them have said to me is that there is this sense of fatigue.
Mhm.
How much churn, how much uncertainty, how much change can they really go through? And it reminded me of, there was a song in the 80s by Johnny Paycheck called "Take This Job and Shove It." And I think that's what a lot of CEOs are saying. So is it right for you? You got to think this through a little bit.
That's right. It is not for everybody. And I do want to, all of this discussion is related to the topic, but to be a little bit more specific about the topic, having been a chief staff executive, having been a number two at a couple of organizations as well, being in one of those top C-suite positions is very different. And I don't think people know what to expect. So Pamela, can you share some insights about how different it really is to be in that nonprofit CEO job? How different is it?
I think it's so reflective of the environment.
Mhm.
The more you know about the organization and the more you know about yourself, the easier the transition is. I think a lot of it comes down to knowing the right questions to ask before you walk in the door. So, what is it really like? You've been in that chair. I haven't been an association CEO. I've certainly sat with a number of them in the confessional, as well as, as well as in the recruiting aspect. But I think, every organization is different, and I don't
Yeah,
know how you
it will.
really,
Well,
how
and
you do that.
one of the things, Pamela, that I hear from younger nonprofit executives who are looking at that top C-suite position, they really don't know what it's like. And so one of the things that some of them have actually gotten angry and frustrated about and have expressed in conversations in networking events or just one-on-one is no one really prepares you for what it's really like
That's true.
to be
That's
a
true.
chief executive, because you go through the process, you ask all the questions. So for example, with my chief staff executive job, it was not through an executive recruiting firm. It was a volunteer search committee. And I think that's, pretty common as well as working with a firm like yours. And actually, full disclosure to our audience, I've actually been interviewed by Pamela for a position.
That's right. Dirty
We
little
had a
secrets.
lovely time, and that's our little secret. And that's one of the ways we became better friends. And every once in a while, Pamela will send me a job opening just so we have a reason to talk. So, but in that situation, I knew, I'd been around the block more than once, as people like to say. And so I went in with the attitude, they have their Sunday best on. And day one, Monday morning, when I start that job, they're all going to be naked. So you need to take that attitude as well. It's like they want to impress you. They want to woo you. If they really like you and they want you to take that job, they're really going to be on their best behavior. You're going to ask all the right questions. You're not necessarily going to get the right answer. And that's a thing to be ready for. Not that they're going to lie to you intentionally or with ill intent, but they may not give you the full picture right off the bat. You may have to dig around a little bit. So when you ask those right questions, when you start the job, if you get that CSE job, top nonprofit CEO job, if you don't feel you got a full picture on that answer, don't be afraid to dig around a little bit, ask a few more questions, get a little more data, get a little more research, make sure they understand what you're asking them as well. So for example, the group I worked with, I asked about starting a reserve fund. And they said, well, we have all this money in the bank. And I said, it's not the same thing.
Right.
That's all the money you have. We need to set aside money. So make sure they understand what you're talking about. Be very clear about what you think the role of the chief staff executive is versus the role of the board. Unfortunately, there are some board members who think you're basically like a receptionist, even if you're the chief staff executive. That's not necessarily the case. You're really more like a CEO of a company than a receptionist. So try to keep that in mind as well. One of the other things is you must keep in mind, and this is a sad and isolating fact of this job, is you are alone.
Mhm.
You are the
That
CSE.
is
There
true.
is no other CSE. And the board is not necessarily your team. The staff's not necessarily your team. You're a team of one. You may have a lot of supporters and a strong network that you can go to and get advice from. But when it comes down to it, you're the one in the room and you're the one managing your relationships and you're the one making decisions and taking that responsibility. So you are an army of one, as the US military used to say.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
It's
and I think
true.
people overlook that, and it's the hard truth of it. It's why Michael Gutierrez and I developed a webinar called the failed CEO
Mhm.
to talk about that. We call it misadventures in the C-suite because sometimes things just don't go to plan, despite your best intentions. I do encourage people. I tried to stick with my word with this group. I tried to stick with my word, my principles. One of the things I verbally committed to was staying for 3 years. And this is where I want to get your input, Pamela. I made a verbal commitment to stay for 3 years. It was not in my contract, or I had a letter of agreement, was not in that. But I made that verbal commitment to stay. But headhunters started calling me 3 months after I started the job. Do you want to interview for
Sure.
the staff executive job? And I said, well, no, I just started this one. And I told them I would stay. So Pamela, do you think is a good, because my attitude, and I would like to get your input on this. My attitude is there's no harm in talking to people if they call you up and say, are you interested in talking about this other job? There's no harm in talking to people. But is there really harm? Am I wrong in that case?
In accepting another job when you're
No, or even in just talking to them, like if you
oh, you know,
started. Mhm.
absolutely. I never can understand why people will not return an email or not return a phone call from a recruiter. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter that you're not currently looking for a job.
Mhm.
You want to build a relationship because a recruiter could very well be your best friend. And if not for you, pay it forward. Develop that relationship with the recruiter so that you can say, gee, I really appreciate the call. It's not really great timing for me,
Mhm.
but I've got somebody based on what you just told me that might be a terrific candidate for it. And here's the name and the number, and I'll whatever it is you want to do to pave the way and introduce the person, but pay it forward. So always take those calls. It really surprises me, as I said, that people choose not to do that.
Well, and I always took the call and had a nice conversation and would say thanks, but no thanks, because I just started and I
All
may
right.
stay for a certain amount of time, but thank you. And I would say if I know someone that might be a good fit, I'll send them your way. I would do that as well. But so then part two of that question, Pamela, what if you've been in a chief staff executive nonprofit CEO job for 3 to 6 months and you start getting calls and something else comes up and it's really interesting and you think it's an even better fit for you? Does that make you look, it might make you look bad to that board, of course, but what about for future employment, or like, is that a wrong thing to do? Should you stay at least a year?
I, you know, I truly believe that's an ethical decision. And if you've made a commitment to that organization and 3 or 4 months or 5 months into it, the a prettier offer comes down the street. I think that says something about you. And unless there is a really good reason for leaving, I've known situations where the job was totally misrepresented to the
Mhm.
individual. And once they got in, the numbers were not at all what they seemed. None of the issues were as discussed. That's a different story. But for you to make a jump or to consider a jump after only being in an organization for a short period of time, I think is a real ethical mistake.
Mhm.
And I think it can come back to haunt you.
Yeah, yeah, I do agree with that. But that, that's my view from where I sit. So I always like to test those views with other people. So I'm glad I'm on the right track with that.
Yeah, right.
I do, because I do think it's important to keep your word. If you give your word you're going to stay, you should do it. And does it always work out? No. To me, and again, this is my opinion, I think it's really sad after I lost my chief staff executive job. I start talking to other chief staff executives and saying, gosh, I feel so awful. It's a terrible experience. What do you think? What advice do you have? And so pretty much everybody I have to say that I talked to said, oh, well, we all get fired at least once, if not
Yeah.
twice. And I was like, what? Oh, and it's never
Rite of
perfect.
passage.
It's never
It's a
perfect.
rite of passage for
And I'm
sure.
like, oh my gosh. But and that's a topic for another day as well, as
Right.
I say. But I was really startled. I think that's really, I'm just going to say, like in 1950s jargon, that's just not cool that works that way. And I think that's some introspection our profession needs to do. So before we wrap up our episode, I can't believe, I mean, this has been so fun. Because I love these topics. They're so meaty, because it's not just about recruiting or getting a job. It's about what kind of a professional are you going to be? What kind of professionals are people like Pamela looking for? And how are we going to make our profession better? How are we going to elevate our profession and really help it build up that respect and integrity? So I did quickly want to ask you, Pamela, what are some differences about working directly with an executive recruiter? You already suggested building a relationship, but what's different about working with an executive recruiter versus, applying for a job that you see posted?
Well, hopefully, first of all, it will be much better organized with a timeline and dates up front and agreed to and so on. So hopefully it's a better structured process. Lots of times they go on a lot longer than we want to. It's not our doing, it's the organization's availability. So sometimes it seems like, oh my gosh, when is this thing ever going to get over? And we recommend strongly against that, because you can lose good candidates that way. I mean, you just kind of lose interest if it goes on for a long time. And we don't want to see a job floating out there in the marketplace for a long time. So hopefully when you work with a recruiter, it's a much tighter timeline. But I think for the flip of that is what, and the search committees will be better prepared to interview. We insist that they go through diversity training so that, some bizarre question doesn't pop out of somebody's mouth. It's a much better evaluation system. It's just a smoother process overall. And they get help on the contract. So because we help them with that, so we can be the adversary, both for the organization and for the individual. So I think there's a lot of reasons to work with recruiters, but I think the flip of that is how to build a relationship with a recruiter if you're not getting the phone calls, right? You got them. But how do you get noticed? Well, the first thing to do is build a good LinkedIn profile, because most recruiters still will go through and take a look at LinkedIn and see what's out there. And you've got to get our attention. So I still see people do things like, I'm the director of human resources. So who cares? So it's make a description, use a descriptive headline of what that means in that particular organization, because human resources means different things in different organizations.
Oh, yeah.
People say, let a team of 10. Who cares? Let a team of 10 to achieve X.
Mhm.
So what is the outcome of the activities, and focusing on facts and measurements and all that kind of stuff. So bottom line is you've got to build a really good CEO, a good LinkedIn profile. And there's a service called Job Scan, where you scan your profile in, and this group, the online service, will optimize it for you, optimize it for LinkedIn. And sometimes that's a good way to do it, because they can pinpoint out keywords and everything. But you've got the best way is to get if you want to know how to get other than LinkedIn, knowing who you are, the elevator speech, all those things that we've been trained to do. But you need to be proactive. And one of the things that you can do is get recommended to a firm. So we all have colleagues who've worked for search firms. I could say, Cecilia, so-and-so is working on a job that might have some interest for me, and I'd love to get introduced to that particular firm. I know you have a relationship with them. Can you introduce me? That carries some weight, especially if the person has some credibility for the job. So recruiters always appreciate referrals. So I think that that's a good thing to do. And then there's also the quid pro quo aspect. So let's say you call up, you see a recruiter who's working on something, and while it's not of interest to you, you think you know the perfect person who might be a really good fit for it. So you call up the recruiter and you say, this looks to be a terrific job. It's not in my wheelhouse, but I know a couple of people that I think you might want to reach out to. Wow, you will always be remembered by that recruiter. So I think that there are some ways like that you can get introduced to recruiters. People, I have candidates say to me all the time, gee, can I call you next week? No, there's no reason for that, right? It's okay to call recruiters, but not every recruiter that works in the space every day. I think you need to be selective about it and make sure that the people that you're calling are really working on positions that have a specific interest for you, that you have the background, the appropriate background for that job. So, I mean, just a few little things like that, but maintain those relationships. I think that the recruiters can always support you in many different ways.
That's really great advice. Thank you. Because I do know I've introduced several people to you over the years.
Yes.
It could be
Much appreciated.
So here's a question I'm just curious about. It's kind of a back end question. A lot of executive recruiting companies have a link where you can just upload your resume into a bank. Do executive recruiters really look at those, or do they really pay attention when you actually apply for something that they're working on?
Well, they are going to go into a system, and I can tell you that we would look at them. Now, I'm not going to be looking at every single resume that comes in, but I have people who work with me that certainly will. So I think, yes, the short answer is yes. And when you upload it to a system, it's the best way to get in their system, because the recruiter is always going to, building a database, that's what we do, right? We need to continue to add to that. And it's a network of personal relationships, but it's also this digital space of having good people in our system that we can reach out to. And some of them are sources of potential candidates, and others are potential candidates themselves. So we like to build a broad network that way. So yeah, I would say yes.
Well, that's good to know, because over the years I have done that. I've shared my resume with, several different, not every single executive recruiting firm, but some different ones that I thought would be good to work with, or maybe had job openings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would do that. So that's good to know. So, well, Pamela, thank you so much for giving us so much of your valuable time today. I so appreciate it. And I like to ask my guest before we sign off, what is the one thought you would like the audience to take away today? And if they want to get in touch with you and maybe build that executive recruiting relationship, what's the best way to get in touch?
Wow. Well, I would say the most important thing is to know who you are, to really do an honest job of self-assessment and self-reflection. Because let's face it, the CEO job may not be right for you, and all CEO jobs aren't right for you. So it's really understanding who you are, and specifically what you bring to a job, and what your motivations are. Why do you want that job? Is it because it's the next step in your career? Nothing wrong with that. You want to build the resume? Nothing wrong with that. But also in combination of, is this an organization whose mission you can get really excited about and you think you can contribute to? So I think it's a pretty basic level, but I think a lot of people don't know who they are. And it really helps, because when you get at the interview table, and you know this, they're going to ask you some questions, and the interviewers are not going to want rote answers. They're not going to want CAE speak, and they're not going to want ASAE speak or anything else. They're going to want you to speak from the heart, from your heart. So I think those are important. And what was the other part of that? Oh, and get in touch.
Yes.
Either personally by email or through my website. I'll get both.
Great. And would you like to share your email and your website?
Sure. Pamela at ASSNstrategies.com, Association Strategies. And the website is just www.assnstrategies.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pamela. That is a great closing thought, because I think knowing who we are is important in our entire life, not just our work life. So thank you so much for sharing, again, so much valuable advice and insight into the CEO job. The CEO nonprofit CEO job, I should say, is it for you? You're really the only one who can answer that question. So that's great. Well, everyone, again, thank you for joining us. To our audience, wherever you may be, I again want to thank my friend and colleague, Pamela Kaul, executive recruiter extraordinaire from Association Strategies. Get to know her. She's great. Whether you're looking at a job through her company or not, you should just know Pamela. So reach out. Thanks for joining us again. And please remember to subscribe so you don't miss another exciting episode. We'll be back next time with Brian Haney of the Haney Company, and he's going to share 3 financial secrets.
And he's great. Thank you, Cecilia. Good to be with you.
Thank you, Pamela. Happy New Year to you. And on behalf of Pamela and myself, thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.